When the assistant stood up, he grabbed Qiao Anxia, who stared at his hand, before rushing behind Lu Jinian. When they reached the elevator, the door had just opened. Lu Jinian entered hugging onto Qiao Anhao, ignoring the both of them. His assistant pulled the dazed Qiao Anxia into the elevator before pressing the button for the ground floor. As soon as the elevator reached the ground floor, Lu Jinian exited with Qiao Anhao while his assistant followed behind, rushing to help him open the car door. After Lu Jinian was settled in the car with Qiao Anhao in his arms, his assistant shut the door and opened the passenger seat. He rushed Qiao Anxia into the car before hurriedly entering the driver's seat and speeding off to the nearest hospital. The assistant sped all the way as silence engulfed the car. No one said a word, and Qiao Anxia was still out of sorts, her mind in a frenzy. She stared at the road ahead in a daze for a long while before turning her eyes towards the rear mirror. Through the mirror, she could see that Lu Jinian still had the same protective stance, his hands tight around Qiao Anhao while her head rested weakly on his chest. Qiao Anhao's face was a deep shade of red. Lu Jinian seemed to be worried that her head would be uncomfortable in that position, for he adjusted her, even arranging her disheveled hair one strand at a time. He was treating Qiao Anhao with utmost care, a gentleness that Qiao Anxia had never seen him show before, completely different from the monster that had inflicted pain on producer Sun. He was even emitting tenderness that was at odds with his usual frosty demeanor. Qiao Anxia felt her throat choke up and her eyes start to hurt, tears welling slightly. She wanted to avert her gaze, but no matter how hard she tried, her eyes were fixed on them. When the car arrived at the hospital emergency department, Lu Jinian left wordlessly, carrying Qiao Anhao. He didn't bother informing his assistant or Qiao Anxia, opening the door and walking towards the hospital doors. His assistant parked the car and the both of them entered the hospital. By then, Lu Jinian had already carried Qiao Anhao to the second floor. Lu Jinian kept Qiao Anhao in his arms as the doctors conducted checks, collected blood samples, took her temperature, and even when the doctors were inserting the IV drip, she was still in his arms. He didn't seem to want to let her go, and after the IV drip was inserted, he looked up and instructed his assistant, "Get a set of clean clothes." The assistant understood that he was referring to clothes meant for Qiao Anhao. He nodded his head wordlessly, leaving with the car keys. Before he left the room, he looked towards Qiao Anxia, who had remained silent all this while, asking, "Miss Qiao, do you need a ride back?" Qiao Anxia shook her head. Lu Jinian's assistant smiled and nodded his head politely, leaving. The hospital room was silent. Qiao Anxia clenched both sides of the chair, turning to look at Lu Jinian, who was still holding Qiao Anhao. His gaze never once left the woman in his arms, as though there was no one else in the room.